Remington podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm sitting down with our known history buffs, research and development engineer Leland Mason.
How's it going?
And ballistics engineer Jimmy Lawrence.
Happy to be here.
We are diving into 223 Remington. Yesterday was 223 day, and so we thought we'd give you this little treat, especially because it is a Remington cartridge. We like to celebrate big here. And Jimmy, can you dive a little bit into the history? I know it started off with the 22 Hornet.
Well, the whole use case does.
Right.
So most of the viewers and listeners today are going to be pretty close to aware on the Army's involvement and Remington's involvement of developing that cartridge alongside Armalite and Stoner for the M16. And we'll get into the why there here in a little bit. But what I found more interesting is the slight changes they made from an existing cartridge were worth their effort. The existing cartridge was developed from the ground up as a brand new idea, and that was the 222 Remington. Mm-hmm. So the 222 started on the heels of a need to get a little bit more energy in the field from a new bolt-action rifle that the gun side was making. And they were trying to make what they called a Super Hornet to replace the 22 Hornet. Mm-hmm. Now, that cartridge was kind of the original varmint round, just on its own to go out and shoot anything from, a prairie dog up to, and possibly, your mileage may vary, a whitetail. It was designed for the military as it was used by the military as a survival cartridge. Okay. So when they developed the 222, they started in 1947, mm-hmm. and were trying to make a cartridge that would feed reliably out of this new action, the 722 rifle. And so the case length and head diameter and all those things, they were aiming for a certain middle of the road velocity and energy. Basically, the rifle designed that cartridge. And they originally started with one that was what we would look at as a 221 Fireball now. Then they stretched it out in 1949 to the modern loaded length. And then they increased the head diameter just a little bit and landed in 1950 with the 222. Now, from there on, that was the basis of most of the development work that landed at 223 Remington. So.
Gotcha. And you were saying, so 222 222 Remington was developed to be a survival load for the Army.
The original 22 Hornet started in the 30s just as a sporting load. Yeah. And then when the Army needed some small, compact survival rifles, mm-hmm. they picked that chambering, and it became very well known for its use there.
I'll just add there, too, that kind of compounded with some development that had been done a little bit later in World War II, though, started kind of the thought process of lighter weight ammo, arguably less powerful, but you can carry more of it. It's more convenient for a survival situation. And then that translated into larger scale, which of course we'll talk about with, the theory behind what would be called the intermediate caliber for military conflicts. So I just thought I'd add that we were talking about.
No, absolutely. I love the concept of a pocket full of shells. Mm-hmm. So you look at a 30 caliber military rifle of the time, you got a pocket full of shells that's like 8. But on a 22 Hornet or even a 223 now, you can mm-hmm. have significantly more ammo on your person and not really notice the increased burden.
Yep. And that's because of weight or size or both.
Yep.
Both.
Yeah. Sure. So later on, the military comes to adopt 223 Remington, and they, why do they choose 223?
Well, 223, they put out, what is essentially a contract offering or a solicitation to evaluate a new cartridge, and it had a set of criteria. And the main of that being a few details is that the rifle that it was going to be chambered with weighed unloaded less than 6 pounds or equal to, so very lightweight, especially compared to what we were previously using with what would have been then M14 and then even yet the M1 Grand. But they had a criteria at 500 yards that you had to have penetration of one side of what was then the M1 helmet, mm-hmm. right? So a military U.S., government issued steel helmet at 500 yards, right? And also, interestingly, that load had to meet the accuracy requirements set forth by was it the M2?
M2 ball.
Yep, which was the 30-06 ammunition out to 500 yards. So, considering a few other factors as well, you also translated that in that solicitation to 135-inch steel penetration at 500 yards. So you had to perforate the steel at that distance. 500 yards, at that time was considered, the grounds and standards for, man-to-man combat. So that's nothing to slouch at. And for the requirements they set forth for cartridge design, this was a really small caliber round, so it really had to have fairly significant performance per caliber to be able to meet the criteria at that distance. So, anyways, Remington was approached and actually Winchester at the same time to develop a cartridge that would meet a 55 grain round at 3,300 feet per second. So that was designed by, I believe it was Stoner, who did the calculations to determine that was the load designed that needed to be met in order to meet this criteria. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, there was a couple engineers involved. I think Stoner came on the rifle side a little bit after that. But what they did when selecting those velocities was they were just loading up, again, 222s.
Yep.
And they found that 3,300 foot a second velocity was going to be what they had to do. And those pressures were too high to design around. So that's where they started moving things around geometry-wise.
Yeah, they called it 222 Special, interestingly enough, as kind of the, not Wildcat, but kind of Wildcat that they were working up based on the 222 Remington. And then, like Jimmy said, once they decided that they needed to meet that 3,300 feet per second mark with a 55 grain bullet, that's when they increased the length of the cartridge a little bit. And rather the case, they increased the length of the case and introduced the 223 Remington. And
fun little muddy section of the product flow, if you will. 222 starts in 1950. 223, we'll call it 1957. So in that intermediate period, this whole program was going along, and several different people had different solutions to the point where Remington had even developed the 222 Remington Magnum. And that one basically survived for about 3 years, and it stuck around in the sporting market for quite some time. But when they moved the shoulder and found that the geometry of the 223 could contain those pressures and reach those velocities, the 222 Rem Mag almost immediately fell to the wayside. And it was another example of a military offering or a trials cartridge that went ahead and jumped into the commercial market to get some steam behind it. And I wouldn't say it was too soon, but it was in parallel and not the final outcome. So back to what Leland was talking about 500 yards being significant range. It really is, especially for us that go out and shoot at animals. But keep in mind the thought process from the military back then was 1,000 yards is a respectable engagement.
Right.
So your 30-06, the M1 Garand, the 1903 Springfield, all of those other previous military chamberings we talked about in the past. I mean, you've got sites graduated out to 2,000 yards, and they still had this idea of volley fire and really long range engagements,
which was ambitious, but it was reality.
Well, you have a whole squad of guys shooting in that general direction.
Yeah, they're going to be in danger for sure.
Yeah.
So they changed the thinking to what can one individual marksman do, and how far is that really effective? And they sacrificed those extra 500 yards on the backside for actually hitting something and hitting something meaningfully out at 500. So y'all have talked about 308 and the military's development there. That was really only to make the 30-06 cartridge feed better automatically. They didn't really cut out a ton of weight. But to go from an M1 Garand where you've got your full rig of 10 clips is 80 rounds to ultimately in Vietnam where the full pack of 7 magazines is 210 rounds is what they were really going for here.
Yeah.
That's impressive. That means that it's less weight, go far.
Sure.
You got
More ammo.
You got an airplane or a ship carrying the ammunition to the field. You got a guy unpacking and loading magazines and then ultimately carrying his own loadout. And then we could talk about hit probability later. The Army really needed to figure out how are we going to get more bang per the pound onto a target.
And there had been a lot of studies, especially at this time, conducted about combat situations with service members under duress shooting. Your chance of hit probability decreases exponentially, right? So the argument was made that increasing the amount of available ammunition that you have to shoot was better than delivering a 10% hit rate with a heavier caliber.
Right. So they were really getting into like statistics. Like this will probably work if they have more shots.
And it was specifically tailored for full automatic fire. So if you've ever fired an M16 or M4, even a shorter barrel version, fully automatic compared to something like, an M14, which, everybody knows is arguably one of the most uncontrollable small arms used in military combat for full auto fire, just because of the platform, but also because of the added recoil. The increase in hit probability that you got at full auto was considered very desirable. So you gain more ammo, better hit probability, and better control, which is part of hit probability in full automatic.
I think we would probably these days use a term in our industry of shootability, right?
Sure.
We talk about handguns, shootability. A great parallel conversation would be 45 auto and all of its momentum and bore diameter. Stepping down to 9mm, you got more ammo, you got more rounds in the magazine, and it's more shootable because you can maintain that muzzle a lot better. Exactly what we're talking about on a scared dude out there shooting at somebody.
Yeah. Easier to hold on to, easier to maintain.
Yeah, because you don't wind up with a marksman that is completely focused on what he's doing every time.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
You saw a shift in the squad tactics to where in Vietnam they would hop out and dump an entire magazine everyone would dump an entire 20-round magazine at an area. That didn't exist before.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talk a lot about military because that's where 223 originated, but I would say in the sporting world, use it a lot for varmints. So what makes 223 a good varmint load?
Well, I mean, there's some debate about a few topics within this subsection, but it's the terminal performance gain that you get with lighter weight versus faster speed, right? So a lot
velocity is energy,
right? And and it's interesting to note. I was reading an article the other day about kinetic energy, which of course is 1/2 mv squared. Velocity is actually a quadratic. But in that, velocity is a quadratic, function inside that formula. So, anyways, argument aside, whether or not someone's practical experience with that, it shows that it is more effective to have higher velocity, for a smaller weight. The name or the word that always comes up, people talk about is, fragmentation. So that was a big thing when the 223 was developed, how effective fragmentation was against, in combat, and then also fragmentation on animals. So,
well, energy transfer at the terminal performance level. So you get all of this energy, it's on paper, here's your muzzle velocity, here's your grain weight of the bullet, and that gives you XYZ in terms of impact energy when you arrive at your target, whatever that is. How do you get that energy into the target? Well, so the military was looking at things like yaw, does it turn sideways? There's a lot of myths and legends about design to tumble and design to fragment.
Terminal wound or temporary wound cavities because of tumbling. And,
But the bottom line is, we in the sporting side of the world get to use pointed soft points, hollow points, things that are designed to expand. And then all of a sudden, your question about varmint usage takes that high velocity and makes it where we can control that expansion to either open up inside of a prairie dog, like with a 45 grain hollow point, or stay tough, like a 62 grain bonded, where I would actually shoot a whitetail with it with correct shot placement. Some states that's not allowed. But this one cartridge now bridges everything from, shooting rats in a field up to taking medium thin-skinned game for food.
Yeah.
And it's all in bullet construction.
And why is the 223 so effective in this?
It's primarily it depends
Velocity.
on It depends on what
It's just
bullet, but it's
fast.
really just the velocity.
Okay.
So before and going back to the roots of not many cartridges around and what do you do when you need to pick one, the alternative was a 220 Swift. That's really fast, but you get say 1,000 to 2,000 shots out of a rifle before its throat is completely eroded.
Sure.
So it's also rimmed, so it doesn't feed reliably out of a box magazine. And on a number of issues like that, the velocity became the conversation in this new project. You'll see when we talk about the solicitation for a small caliber high velocity, they use the velocity as the selling point for the lethality of the cartridge, to the point where it was almost a marketing campaign
Yeah.
to make people become aware that all of a sudden 3,300 foot a second is something different than a big 180 grain 30 caliber bullet going 2,600 feet a second.
Kind of trying to make them equal in a sense in the marketing world.
Well, a lot of people didn't take this new varmint cartridge and respect it. They call it a mouse round and things like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Poodle shooting cartridge.
Yeah, and that argument has not stopped up until today. We still have that argument in all walks of this conversation.
That's crazy because of all the technological advances in bullet design and shape and all of that. So
Yeah, how much is enough and how much is too much?
Sure.
So an interesting little anecdote. My dad was a doctor in the Air Force, and he went to Southeast Asia in 1970 to 1972. Even then, after the Air Force had this cartridge for, let's call it 10 years,
sure.
they were still perpetuating some of the ideas that the velocity was making it something different than a normal wound cavity and normal lethality. They were telling these doctors that any hit inside of the proximal to the elbow or the knee or within an inch of the head was going to be a lethal wound. And after a lot of data and more data and statistics, they realized maybe that wasn't exactly the case, but they were still trying to wrap their heads around what does that energy transfer look? What does that velocity look like in terms of military usage? Varmint and small games, we get to do our science a lot quicker, and you can see the results there.
Yep.
So
That's the whole hydrostatic shock argument.
another argument. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. And one of the big questions that we get a lot in comments and questions at shows and all that is, what is the difference between 223 and 5.56 NATO, and why would they choose one or the other?
It's a good question. It's essentially how the ammunition's manufactured. There are a few geometrical differences, and there is one criteria that you want to make sure to pay attention to when you're buying ammunition for a certain rifle, right? Depending on what it's chambered in.
It's the chambering.
Right.
Yeah.
So 223 is a SAMI introduced and controlled cartridge, right? We load 223. It's influenced by SAMI. 5.56 by 45, as you would see it on store shelves today, was a NATO spec adoption of a essentially very, very similar, almost identical round. The difference is primarily, and I'm sure Jimmy may have a few other things, but the main thing is in a gun chambered in 5.56 by 45, the lead is slightly longer. So that means that if you take a cartridge adopted and designed for 5.56, the bullet ogive, the profile, overall, what the critical feature is the jump, right? Or how far off the bullet is when it's chambered from actually engraving in the rifling.
Yeah, free bore, lead, jump, all those
Right.
little bump right before you hit.
Before it gets to the twisting.
Rifling.
Yeah.
If you take that cartridge that is optimized for a 5.56 within the boundaries and specifications of that chamber and put it in a 223, you could run into a situation where your round is actually touching the rifling, which could result in an overpressured situation, right? There's no jump. The bullet doesn't jump. It doesn't go through the free bore without any resistance, which is what a cartridge is designed to do in a rifle bullet. That free bore section, the lead depth, the angle, all that stuff is changes between different chamberings. But between the two, you don't want to shoot 5.56 and a 223 because of that exact reason. Overall, there have been some adjustments to that concept, right? Like 223 Wild is a chambering
Meet in
where
the middle.
you take the overall case dimensions, CIP NATO controlled of 5.56 by 45, but you use the freebore length of a 223, so you can reliably chamber both of them without having that situation. So.
Yeah, there's a couple moving parts there. So the 223 Remington chamber is intrinsically more accurate because you start stabilizing that bullet sooner. You engrave your riflings while you've still got a little bit of heel in the neck of the case. The jump from 223 to 5.56 was in the late 70s and 80s, and there was a couple things they needed to get done. They needed to get a heavier bullet, so they needed to stabilize it. So they had to standardize a tighter twist rate. They wanted more life and reliability out of a light machine gun. So the increased throat length gave you a decrease in pressure where you can load it a little bit higher with a longer bullet. And also, this is FN doing this, and on their side of things, you get a longer life out of a machine gun barrel. So Leland touched on a few things there that we can specify a little bit. I'm not going to go down to the exact pound per square inch, but the 5.56 NATO cartridge was standardized at a higher pressure, a chamber pressure, and of course it's tested differently from how we test ammunition on a semi-compliant basis. So let's say you have about 5,000 more pounds of pressure to work with.
Okay.
Yeah,
Now you take that cartridge that's loaded around 60 instead of 55. You drop it over to a commercial chambering, and then you're going to pick up about another 5,000 pounds because of that lack of jump.
Okay.
You compound those two together, and all of a sudden you're operating up closer to 70,000 PSI where you don't really want to be. So add all that together, you'll find rifles out there roll marked 223 Remington. You'll find rifles roll marked 5.56 NATO or 5.56/223. It's a one-way trip. You can buy our standard commercial ammo and shoot it through any M4 type rifle
Chambered
or any
in
M16
5.56.
that's chambered in 5.56 and go hunt with it and things like that. But if you have a Green Army ammo can of surplus, green tip,
M855, M193,
you're not going to want to put it in Grandpa's varmint
In a
rifle
223,
as a Mauser action, right?
So that's
That is good to know.
primary difference, which, it's interesting, as prolific as 223 and 5.56 are nowadays, especially with the, popularity of the AR-15 and rifles that are similar or based off of that, right? It's kind of interesting that there's that much of a difference that actually is a pretty significant, noteworthy difference between the two.
That people need to know about.
Yeah.
Don't
for
be
sure.
blowing up your barrels out
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
for sure.
This is one of two examples. Well, there's probably more. But we talk about military cartridges all the time, and we've had several shows here about those things. You look at something like 7.62 by 39.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's only going to be chambered in a military rifle, and you actually are going to have a hard time finding a hunting cartridge outside of our catalog.
Yeah, I was about to say, we have...
Some folks do go and buy an SKS or whatever and buy some really good high quality ammo for it. For the most part, that system as a weapon system is a tuna can of ammo and the matched chamber rifle that go together.
Yeah.
You get into the 308.
Lacquered steel case. Yeah. Corrosive in some cases.
It's a system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you get into 308 compared to 7.62 by 51, or you get into 223 versus 5.56. All of a sudden, you have an entire huge commercial market for the guns and ammo, and all of our freedom of selection to shop for exactly what we want, all the time backed by this military standardization on twist rates, bullet selection, and what that ammo is supposed to do.
Yep.
So kind of brackish waters on how those technologies kind of overlap. Did one make the other or vice versa?
Right.
But it is really fun history on this one because it's spanned the last, what are we getting, close to 60 years?
Yeah, and it's still
70
very
years?
strong, very popular.
75 years?
Yeah, it'd be 75. Yeah,
I love watching you guys do math.
I think. Yeah,
My final question here, guys, is 223, again, going back to like the varmint world, is a very popular varmint hunting round. What is the principle of a varmint cartridge? Like, what are we looking for when we think, I want to use this to shoot hogs, coyotes,
Reaction.
foxes?
Yeah. I mean, instant, very quick reaction terminally.
Yeah, I think, and we've touched on this before, it really comes down to, do I want to eat that thing, or do I want to come out here as a pest control or even as a pastime? If you want to shoot a squirrel or a similar sized rodent for food, you're going to use a 22 or a shotgun and not tear the meat up. But if you want to take a pickup truck out into the plains and shoot prairie dogs, you're not going to go pick all those things up. Then you want to have a flat shooting, accurate, high velocity, and quickly expanding
Round.
offering.
You got a tiny little body.
Yeah.
You want to deliver as much of the energy as possible
Within
on whatever
inches.
you're shooting. Yeah. So you have to have something that takes a 3,000 plus feet per second projectile.
Yeah.
It delivers energy in a space the width of your hand.
Small space. Yeah. You need it to be accurate and you need to be fast.
That's the epitome of a varmint cartridge. So
So whether it's tipped or a hollow point, most of the time you'll see quick expansion as the antithesis to a heavier bullet with slower expansion, like the bonded core locked. And selecting that muzzle velocity, twist rate, and bullet construction are how you go bridge that gap from a prairie dog to a whitetail.
Yep.
And what are our, Remington offerings that we have in 223?
We have a lot.
Yeah.
If you look at our catalog, you're going to see everything from, what would be considered very close to M193 full metal jacket, 55 grain, 3,250 feet per second military training round, all the way to a bonded offering. We've got expanding hollow points. You have your core locked offerings, so standard soft points. I mean, we have a whole gambit of match rounds as well. So a lot of match offerings. So there's because of the proliferation of that cartridge and different rifles chambered for it around the world, especially in the United States, we've got a plethora of offerings to choose from.
Yeah, similar to the 9mm, we have a huge example of the economy of scale there. Because like Leland's mentioning, we're not making ammo for any standing army, but we're making 55 FMJ all day, every day, because people go out and plink with this thing.
Right.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden we can also offer 77 grain match for competitive shooters. And I think the AccuTip V is still around. It's one of those examples of lower weight, higher velocity, quick expansion.
With that polymer tip that everyone loves.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sitting down with me, guys.
Yeah.
223 day is a big deal around here, so I appreciate it.
3 is a great cartridge. It's good for a lot of uses.
Yeah.
Pocket full of bullets.
Yeah.
I like that. That might be the title of the podcast.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
There you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions for me or the engineers here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.